This is a map that could save European football. Not because the football is bad, but because the system underneath it is starting to break. And in this episode, we move from diagnosis to design. I'll show you how structuring Europe into 8 regional ecosystems could address the scale problem at its core, protecting identity while also strengthening the competitive balance. Because if the imbalance is structural, the response has to be structural too. Hello my soccer universe, my name is Roland and this is Football Talk, and welcome to the second episode of this series where we ask how we can fix the structural imbalance in European football without sacrificing the identity of European football. Last time we spent an entire episode on examining what is wrong. Basically that's the diagnosis episode, widening financial gaps, we have league gravity and all that kind of things that cannot be solved by a regulation, because it is at its core a scale problem. Certain leagues have more gravity. And in this episode, I want to now turn to the treatment plan, diagnosis, treatment, you get the idea, where we want to redesign the map of Europe itself, or maybe the UEFA map itself, so smaller leagues can actually grow and mid-tier ecosystems can stabilize, because those are the ones that are really at risk of losing, not only competitively, but also structurally and economically. But we also want to do this in such a way that the top level doesn't have to cannibalize everything beneath it and still will be very, very viable. But before we look into the nitty-gritty of how I am proposing to do that, let's summarize the last episode, and you can find, of course, the entire episode in the playlist to this video, but you can also find the link up here. Basically what I said is that the quality at the top remains incredibly high in Europe. European football is still the best in the world. However, we have financial gravity that pulls everything upward, because the big leagues come from big countries that have more scale, and therefore they're taking everything from the lower leagues. And it's actually a food chain where the Premier League sits very much on top. Again, this is not anti-Premier League, this is just a reality. And as a result, the gaps between the leagues are widening. I mean, look at the Champions League. We have now in the round of 16, there are 6 Premier League teams in there. And at least one of them is not really that good, if not 2. And this gap is something that has to worry European football a whole lot. Also, the financial instability behind everything should worry European football a whole lot. That's why the Super League has actually been floated. But this was only a fix for the top teams. And speaking of fixes, some structural fixes like FFP and so on have not really worked either. They just cemented the discrepancy and actually allowed it to grow even more. So the conclusion I made in the last episode was we manage scale through regional frameworks. We make regions within Europe to strengthen the mid-tier ecosystems, and we do that by enabling gradual mergers of smaller leagues that actually will address the scale problems, because smaller leagues are from smaller countries. If you put smaller countries together, this becomes a bigger region, and that would actually then rebalance European competition. It's in a way also splitting UEFA into separate regions, which actually is not that revolutionary or radical, because many large confederations manage scale through regions. In Africa, the African Confederation is split into North, South Africa, East Africa, West Africa. There are many different regions in there that actually work together, have even their own regional national team tournaments and so on. Because Africa is a huge country. Europe is much smaller, which is one, we talk about the reasons why UEFA does not have a regional system, but one reason is definitely that Europe is a small continent. Same thing goes for Asia, and in Asia they even have the additional benefit that structurally weaker teams can have access to huge competitions. So we have India, for instance, at the Asian Cup. CONCACAF has the Caribbean Federation in there and has also Mesoamerica. So they all have their own subdivisions that are working within themselves under a larger umbrella, and this regional governance increases the competitive balance. In that sense, UEFA is the outlier. But here's a quick look at history why UEFA is actually not regionalized at all. I mean, you have to go back to the founding of UEFA, and the reality was the Cold War. We had East versus West. And that divide shaped the governance because UEFA was seen as a body that was bridging these divides. So there was not really an interest in regionalizing into a Western and an Eastern UEFA because we didn't want to entrench this division even more. We wanted that these two sides can actually meet. But then crucially, once the Iron Curtain fell, many states started to crumble, especially Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. And I cannot emphasize that enough. In 1989, UEFA was a much smaller confederation. I mean, Yugoslavia alone split into 6 confederations and the Soviet Union in even more than we had also Czechoslovakia. It was all way more condensed. And so there was also not necessarily a need because of that for regionalization. But once the Iron Curtain fell and the countries fractured, UEFA was mostly interested in creating many new countries because this also increased their voting power within FIFA. But they did so because they wanted to get these votes and to quickly get it done, but no one had the time to think about internal restructuring. And so the flat structure became the norm. That's why UEFA is relatively flat. But what I'm now proposing is, well, we have not done it 30 years ago when we probably should have thought about that because it was a new reality, but we can do it now. But we have to do it intelligently. And what I basically did is I took a map of Europe, a map of UEFA, and I divided it up into 8 distinct regions. But I followed certain rules. The regions had to be geographically adjacent. So it had to be real blocks, not disjoint regions, because that does not really foster cooperation very well. The regions also had to be comparable in scale and viability. And most crucially, I did not want to have 2 or even more of the major leagues in one region, because that would be counterproductive. We want the major leagues all have their own region and they're the anchor league in that region. I also try to take into account existing football ecosystems. For instance, many players, let's say from Ireland, naturally gravitate, or Scotland, naturally gravitate towards the Premier League. So we want to enable that. Same thing, Portugal towards Spain. Many Balkans go rather first to Italy. Austrian players and Swiss players, Czech players probably gravitate more towards the Bundesliga. So this was also something that I took into account when creating this map and these 8 regions. And then lastly, when I considered border cases, because there were a couple of countries where I could have gone either way. I look at it politically and culturally. Where would this country fit better in order, conflicts cannot always be avoided, especially in geographically large regions. How we want to make it in such a way that we can at least avoid conflicts from the get-go. As I said, it's not all possible, especially when you look at the final outcome. The 8 regions I tried to name geographically. I was very tempted to call the Northwestern Region the British Islands region. We have also the Southwestern Region. It would be, of course, the Iberian region, but these are all subcategories, and it gets a little bit more tricky when you move into the other regions. The Western region is probably one of the more interesting ones because it is France plus the Benelux countries. Then we have the Southern region, which is centered around the Adriatic Sea, so Italy and half of former Yugoslavia, if you would like. Then we have the Central Region, a massive region that we will spend a lot of time on in this episode, which is basically Germany plus the other majority German-speaking countries plus the Visegrad countries. And then the Northern Region, which is basically Scandinavia plus the Baltic countries. Then we have a Balkan Anatolian region. And then we have, and probably the most complicated region is, of course, the Eastern region, which is not the leftover. Actually, if Russia was part of it, and we also spent some time on that, this would actually be a very viable region. At the moment, this region is probably the most difficult of them all, especially since we don't quite know what the status of Russia within UEFA actually is. So we have to consider that one too. But before we talk about the complications in the eastern regions, let's walk through the regions and let's do it bit by bit. We go from slightly easier definable regions to the harder ones, and we start in the Northeastern Region, which is basically the home nations all thrown together. To me, this was one of the easiest regions to create, because the Premier League is basically the vortex for everything in there. But we also had the discussions, for instance, of a Celtic League where Scotland and Ireland joined together. Maybe Northern Ireland could join there as well. We also had the thoughts of Rangers and Celtic going into the Premier League and so on. Here would be, and we'll talk about how this actually could work eventually, here would be a framework where this actually might happen. Yes, Ireland is relatively empty on this map because there's no Irish club that really has the same weight as the counterparts in the Premier League or even in the Scottish Premiership. But with such a regionalization, the League of Ireland, which has been growing already, and there have been quite some success stories, could actually elevate itself even more. We have, of course, the Iberian region. I think the only sticky point here is Gibraltar, but that's a minor thing. I think Gibraltar will not play a huge role in this region as it is with Andorra. I mean, this is basically the top clubs in Portugal moving into La Liga, but on a more structural scale. It does not mean that there won't be other Portuguese clubs, but I think to me it makes sense. They're on the same ecosystem. Spain and Portugal work already relatively closely together. Them joining together is more or less a given. The gravity in there, of course, is still Barcelona and Real Madrid. And this region, whatever might happen, will still have Barcelona and Real Madrid. And that is basically the driving force, the elite in this region. As I said, the Western region to me is probably one of the most intriguing because these are three major leagues plus Luxembourg that are almost on a similar scale. It's also interesting because we have the high population density in the Netherlands and in Belgium, with the relatively sparsely populated French region that is actually reflected quite well here on the map. It also would pit some Benelux giants with some huge French clubs. I think this could be a super intriguing league overall. It is also a region where a whole lot of development is happening. Many great players are developed in this region. And I have to say, while the scale is probably favoring France over Belgium and the Netherlands, the Belgium and the Netherlands combined could be a counterweight already for France. So I see this quite well, and I think they have also the club power with the big three from the Netherlands plus, let's say, Club Brugge and Anderlecht from Belgium to really make this a very viable region. Note, I'm talking region, I'm not talking a huge league yet. I also considered for this region adding Switzerland, but it would look geographically awkward and it also would not. Yes, Switzerland has a French-speaking part, and I think the Swiss league would also fit kind of nicely in there, but I feel in the central region, Switzerland is a little bit more at home. I also considered Switzerland for the southern region, and having said that, I mean, I would have loved to just split Switzerland in three parts, which of course is not something that is easily done. The southern region, yes, the gravity here is Serie A, but I also wanted to make this culturally and football economically viable. We know that many Croatian players, Slovenian players and Albanian players are already moving into Serie A. So the relationships between Italy and these countries on the other side of the Adriatic is actually a reality already. The question is, where do I draw the line? Would I include Serbia in there? And then I said, well, if I have it like that, yes, Albania, Bosnia and so on, this is probably majority Muslim, but the other countries from former Yugoslavia here have all a Catholic background, so it fits better with Italy. And that I draw then the line to Serbia, which is an Orthodox country. And lastly, I also decided to put Kosovo together with Albania because cultural ties and not too much friction with Serbia, but I know this could cause all kinds of trouble. It's also maybe the one region where the boundaries might change. For me, I've designed the regions to be actually stable geographically, but there's always the option for Bosnia splitting up, in which case the Republika Srpska will of course go into the Southeastern region. But overall, I think this is a very interesting region, a very fiery region in many regards. I always call it the Adriatic region, but when I look at the map, there's only one team at the Adriatic, which is of course Hajduk, which is not even one of the huge clubs, I would say, even though Hajduk within the context of Croatia and even for Yugoslavia was an absolute massive club, but they are currently nowhere near Dinamo Zagreb. I find it interesting that many big Italian clubs are more on the other side of Italy, so away from the Adriatic. Just pointing that one out. Let's come to the Colossus, the second most populous region, which is the Central Region. Or I would have loved to call this the Mitropa region with, Mitropa Cup and so on, but Central Region it is. Now, this is an extremely layered region. We have German-speaking parts, we have Slavic-speaking parts, we have Hungary in there. We have a lot of cultural history, but also divisions in there. But the one thing that really unites this region is that if you ask any citizen from any of these countries, from which part of Europe they are from, they will always say Central Europe. And so, for me, the two borderline cases, Switzerland and Poland, were in a way defined by this very fact. Yes, adding Poland to this region made this region humongous. I totally understand that. But if I ask my Polish work colleague, she will always say, we're Central Europe. Same thing goes for the Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Austrians, Swiss as well. For me also, Switzerland feels more at home in this region because growing up, it was always Germany, Austria and Switzerland, the German-speaking countries. Switzerland is majority German-speaking, and if I look at the biggest Swiss clubs at the moment, yes, they are Servette Genf, but they're not as big as Basel or Young Boys, for instance. Therefore, I added those in there. And yes, if you look at the map, there's one team that should not be there, that is not up to scale with the other teams that are pictured there, but that of course had to be there because it's my club. But this to me is a core region for UEFA. It's a humongous region, it's a very powerful region. It is also a region that will allow some lower mid-tier leagues with huge cities, and I'm speaking here of Budapest, Vienna and Prague, to actually revive some old rivalries and maybe be in a larger scale context to actually be more viable and more noticeable on an international scale. We'll come back to the Central Region a little bit later in the video as well, but I want to now move to more or less the exact opposite of that region, which is the Northern Region. The Northern Region is basically Scandinavia plus the Baltic countries, and throw in Finland of course as well. I had a thought of putting Iceland and Faroe Islands maybe in the Northwestern Region because they are northwest, but I think culturally they are way more aligned with Denmark, Norway and Sweden, so they fit more naturally in there. This is population-wise the smallest region. It's also the one region that does not have automatically a huge league in there. The two big leagues in there are the Danish Superliga and the Allsvenskan. So this is more a cooperative league where many countries are very similar in size. It's basically a downsized version of the Western region. The Baltic countries, I was initially thinking to put in the Eastern region, but I think culturally and the way they see themselves, they are way more aligned with the nations that are across the Baltic Sea, Sweden, Finland and so on, and especially Estonia and Finland share similar languages, so this made it natural to put those in there, even though in a more recent historic context they probably would have fit better in an Eastern League. However, I feel in a current reality the Baltic states need to be in the Northern League and actually will have a good development base there as well. Okay, we're done with the easier regions. Now let's move to the southeast. This is another quite weighty region, taking the Turkish Super League and doing it together with the Greek Super League, and then add the major clubs, for instance, from Serbia, Romania and Bulgaria in there, makes this an extremely varied but weighty region. Yes, economically not as strong as others that we've talked so far. However, I think this one has a lot of potential. for growth, also for league mergers that might happen and cooperation between these. You have massive clubs with massive support, you have massive population centers, but you also have, and this has to be said, really, really hot rivalries. This could be a region that will always be watched, and yes, there are many frictions between these countries, I'm fully aware. And for good measure, I also added Israel in there because they just fit best in there. Same thing for Cyprus. But overall, this is a super weighty, but also in a way logical region to have. It's the Balkan Anatolian region, if you would like. I also want to mention, lastly, I should have mentioned before, I decided to put Moldova, despite Transnistria, together with Romania because culturally those are close. And then the rest goes into the Eastern region, which, yes, was formed maybe a little bit more by exclusion, but if you look at it on a map, if Russia was a factor within UEFA, this region would make a whole lot of sense because the Russian Premier League would really anchor this region very, very, very well, and you would revive all Soviet rivalries with the Dynamos from Minsk, especially Kiev, and also from Tbilisi. You have some more modern upstarts like Karabakh and of course Shakhtar Donetsk, but you have also the massive Russian clubs, especially the four from Moscow, but also Zenit in there. This would be a really cool region if political realities would not say else. Now, we have to say, Russia at the moment is a wildcard. We don't know whether Russia will stay within UEFA or not, or whether Russia would even be able to play Ukrainian clubs ever again. So the Russia factor is the one that could make or break this region, but I don't want to make a proposal that actually could collapse just based on Russia alone. This concept needs to be way more weighty. So if Russia is not a factor, let's say Russia leaves for the Asian Confederation, or there's no reconciliation ever possible between Russia and its neighboring country, and Russia is meddling a lot there, we know that. Here is an alternate solution. Take Russia out, and begrudgingly I would move the Turkish Super League into the Eastern region. It's the only league that can match up in scale with whatever we have in Russia. And yes, we have Armenia, we have Azerbaijan, Turkey, and so on. There's a whole lot of pitfalls that can happen there. And with Ukraine being relatively weak at the moment, one needs a Super League. I mean, ideally, the Ukrainian Premier League and the Turkish Super League would actually anchor this quite nicely with huge clubs that have a similar scale, similar weight, and then you have some developmental regions that actually also pull in some power as well. I'm looking especially at Azerbaijan, but also at Kazakhstan. It's a little bit more disjointed without Russia, though. That also has to be said. If Turkey would switch over, then yes, the Southeastern Region becomes a whole lot smaller, but I think it's still quite viable. Then it's the Greek Super League that does carry that one, but you add two of the strongest leagues in Eastern Europe, in Serbia and Romania, plus Bulgaria. That is already a really, really strong framework as well. Yes, it gets elevated through Turkey, but I think these four nations anyway have been talking about hosting a World Cup, so they could also go it alone. And again, the Eastern region is probably the most complicated one due to current geopolitics. We have now defined the regions. How do we work within these regions? The most important thing, while it is easy to say, let's make a Central League, let's make a Western League and so on, I do not want to have sudden full-scale mergers. I want to actually keep the big leagues, at least initially, intact. And we have these regions defined that the smaller leagues can voluntarily decide, do we want to merge or not? But we have now a framework for that. We will not have, for instance, and I'm saying now a wild one, that the Eredivisie says let's go together with the Polish Ekstraklasa, because it will increase our scale. No, we have now defined contexts where smaller leagues can decide, okay, let's go it together, let's increase our scale a little bit, this will give us additional revenue. And once these leagues merge, they will create larger leagues that equalize the scale, and then we can always go upward. Of course, the long-term goal would be to have a unified regional top tier. What I still would like to do is still crown national champions. However we want to do it. Let's say we have in each region, and let's take for instance the Western region, we have now a super regional structure with the Benelux countries and France, and then we have second tiers within each of these countries. I would not give the top team from the second tiers that are just in the respective countries the championship. This could be done by potentially replacing cup competitions or awarding that one to the best placed team from that country. But national champions are a point of pride that should still exist. But you could also win a regional championship eventually. We'll discuss this probably in a fourth episode, but I want to make it absolutely clear. I don't want these regions to merge immediately. This has to be gradually done. And I want to show this as an example from the Central Region, because this is the one where we have the most to play at, and see an event horizon about 40 or 50 years for this one. But let's say we have the Central Region. Currently, there are already two countries that are together, which is of course Liechtenstein and Switzerland, but Liechtenstein is a small quantity. This is basically the Swiss Super League where there are Liechtenstein clubs in. It's a little bit like Wales and England, if you would like. Now, all these countries have different economic realities, have different population weight and backgrounds. This cannot be that we say, okay, the Austrian Bundesliga is together with Germany. No. I think for it to be viable, or even more realistic and discussed, Switzerland going together with Austria, but then Switzerland would say, yeah, but we have to pay for Austria because the economic reality is very, very different. So we have to look also at economic realities, and for me, the first reasonable merger within the system would, of course, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but I would also add Hungary. This creates now a block of countries that are economically similar, but also politically very much aligned, and crucially also within the European Union. So that would make it easy. Now the question is, let's say this league works well, can establish itself, where could it expand to? And here is where I think the next logical step would be to add the Polish Ekstraklasa. Yes, it makes it automatically a much bigger league. The previous one had a population center of roughly, let's say, 25 to 30 million. Poland alone has 45 to 50 million. So you basically double the scale right there. But because Czechia, Slovakia and Hungary would work well together, this would make it attractive for Poland, who has similar economic weight and politically very much aligned with these countries currently as well, to actually join in. Now, the Central Region has actually one huge league in the Bundesliga, which we have not touched yet. Another huge league with what I call now the Visegrad League, for obvious reasons. And then we have Austria and Switzerland. Two much smaller leagues with slightly different economic realities. However, for Austria now, it might become really attractive to see this huge league with quite some power, where that actually probably has some financial backing already. This is now a league that Austria would be ready to join without being seen as the sugar daddy of this league. Actually, they would join as a junior partner in that. And suddenly, we have a really huge Eastern structure there that Switzerland, for similar reasons to Austria, would of course also be ready to join. And then the region is almost split in two. But now we would be at the stage. I'm not saying we have to go there. But we would be at a stage where we could, for instance, make a two-tiered system covering all 8 countries, where the German Bundesliga would join up with such a huge block. And that would make this a super regional league, a two-tiered system, and then maybe you break it up into regional leagues. Whatever way. But this is something that has to grow steadily. It has to realize economic realities, but it also has to see how it can politically work. But I think this would be a pathway that I could foresee. Way more realistic than having an Alps League or a Danubian League is actually this pathway right here. Now, structural reform is never just technically, it's quite politically as well. And domestic top clubs, especially the ones in the middle tier, will of course worry about the dilution. National associations might fear losing control. UEFA's governance structure would probably resist adaptation to all that. And the biggest leagues that are currently benefiting from the scale may see little reason to change that. And then we also have the fans, where identity, tradition, and rivalries actually do matter. And these are not spreadsheets. This is stuff that actually matters. But you also have to consider the alternative. The structural imbalance will continue to widen and the gravitational pull at the top will only intensify. Smaller leagues will struggle to keep pace, competitive access will narrow, and the idea of a closed or semi-closed Super League will never really disappear. Even though it just went away, I don't think it really went away. What I'm trying to say is that if a reform doesn't happen in a structured way, consolidation may happen anyway, just without any safeguards. And resistance also doesn't automatically mean impossibility. The real question is not who just might oppose this, but how reform could be structured in a way that aligns incentives instead of threatening them. And the other question, of course, is could stronger regional ecosystems actually protect the top leagues from long-term instability? Because that's also a reality. Could UEFA redefine its role from a regulator to an architect? And could smaller leagues gain leverage without dismantling national identity? These are the things that I want to look in the next episode, where we look at all this. Who stands to lose? Who stands to gain? How can resistance be transformed into momentum? Because if reform is going to happen, it won't happen by accident. It has to happen by design. And so, if you made it this far, I genuinely love to hear your thoughts on these regions here. Which regions feel realistic, which feel impossible? Leave a comment, like the video if you found the idea compelling, and subscribe if you want to follow the full series. And one thing is for certain, however you decide, I will talk to you soon about more things in my soccer universe. Bye!